Hey guys, welcome back to another long meandering wander through history. Tonight, we're drifting back a couple thousand years to the eternal city, Rome. A city of marble and mud, senators and slaves, bathhouses and backstabbing. So, grab a blanket, maybe something to sip, because tonight, we're going to slowly sink into what daily life was actually like in ancient Rome. Not the gladiator movies, not the toga parties, but the real thing. The smells, the gossip, the food that might give you food poisoning, and the fashion choices that definitely would. Let's start slow, as the Romans would, preferably lying down with a piece of questionable cheese in hand.
The Roman morning, or too early for empire. A Roman morning started early, like painfully early, around sunrise, which is already too ambitious for a civilization that didn't even have coffee. Instead, they had posca, a delightful mix of sour wine and water, because apparently hydration should always come with regret. Most Romans lived in insulae, which were kind of like ancient apartment buildings. Tall, narrow, and more flammable than you'd like to imagine. They were often built out of cheap wood and clay bricks. The walls cracked, the upper floors swayed in the wind, and if your upstairs neighbor decided to dump a chamber pot out the window, well, congratulations, you're baptized. For the elite, mornings were different. If you were a senator, a wealthy merchant, or just someone whose family had blackmailed their way into power a few generations ago, you'd start your day with a servant dressing you. That's right, dressing you. Because nothing says manly Roman virtue quite like having another man tie your sandals for you. They'd help you into your tunic, a kind of linen shirt that looked like a shapeless nightgown, and then, if you were fancy, you'd throw a toga over it. And the toga, by the way, was not the easy, graceful garment Hollywood makes it out to be. It was basically 15 feet of heavy wool wrapped around you in a system so complicated that there were slaves whose only job was toga management. Yes, professional toga wranglers. If you were a Roman senator, your toga was white with a purple stripe, because the purple dye came from the glands of sea snails and therefore screamed, "I have too much money and too little empathy." Breakfast, or what do you mean, that's it? Breakfast was usually small and disappointing. Think bread, cheese, maybe some olives if you were lucky. The Romans weren't big on breakfast. They thought eating early was a bit crude, which is ironic considering this was a society that literally had vomitoriums in their dining halls. For poorer Romans, breakfast was whatever they could grab from the local street vendors. Maybe some barley porridge, maybe a leftover crust from the day before. And for the ultra-rich, they'd probably just skip breakfast and save their appetite for the midday feast, because gluttony is all about pacing. The Roman streets, or noise, smell, and the occasional donkey chase. By mid-morning, Rome was alive, bustling, chaotic, and loud, like if New York and Naples had a child raised by construction workers. The streets were narrow and often lacked sidewalks. Pedestrians had to share space with carts, animals, beggars, vendors, and the occasional runaway slave. It wasn't exactly pedestrian-friendly, more like good luck and may Jupiter be with you. Vendors sold everything from figs and fresh bread to fried dormice, which, yes, are exactly what they sound like. The Romans treated dormice as delicacies. They'd fat them up in little clay jars and then roast them with honey and poppy seeds, because of course they did. The air was a cocktail of smoke, sewage, perfume, and ambition. Public toilets were communal, meaning you sat elbow to elbow with strangers, all sharing the same sponge on a stick for cleanup duty. The same sponge on a stick. They rinsed it in vinegar water, sure, but still, not exactly hygienic. And yet Rome functioned, somehow. The Roman Forum, or where gossip meets government. By late morning, the action moved to the Forum, Rome's beating heart. It was where business deals were made, court cases argued, and reputations destroyed. Picture a mix between a courthouse, a stock exchange, and a very aggressive social club. Politicians in togas strutted about pretending to be virtuous, orators shouted about justice, and everyone else just gossiped about who was sleeping with whom. And spoiler, it was usually everyone with everyone. You could buy almost anything in or around the forum. Jewelry, slaves, exotic spices, scandal, and the gossip. Oh, the gossip. Romans were obsessed with status, and reputations could rise or fall on rumors alone. If Twitter existed in ancient Rome, the empire would have collapsed in about a week.
Midday meal, or the power lunch Roman style. By noon, people got hungry. The poor grabbed another cheap snack, maybe boiled beans or bread soaked in wine, while the rich returned home for prandium, a light lunch that often involved cold leftovers from the previous feast. But lunch wasn't really the main event. That was dinner, cena, and Romans treated dinner like an Olympic sport. The Roman home, or luxury but make it drafty. The homes of the wealthy, domus, were beautiful in a "we conquered Greece and stole their aesthetic" kind of way. They had mosaics, marble floors, and walls painted with scenes from mythology, usually involving someone being dramatically kidnapped by a god. At the center was the atrium, open to the sky, with a shallow pool to catch rainwater. It was elegant, yes, but also meant you could get soaked indoors during a storm. Fashion over function, even back then. The bedrooms were tiny, more like closets, because Romans didn't spend much time there. Social life revolved around the dining room, or triclinium, where they ate lying down on couches propped up on one elbow like decadent sea lions. Dinner time, or past the stuffed flamingo. When dinner time rolled around, usually around 3 or 4 p.m., the wealthy turned it into a spectacle. There were courses, there was entertainment, there were probably too many lamps. A typical fancy meal might include oysters from the coast, peacock tongues, roasted boar, and yes, stuffed flamingo. They loved exotic foods, mostly because it showed off how far their empire reached, and also because the Roman palate was creative. They flavored everything with garum, a fermented fish sauce that was made by leaving fish guts to rot in the sun. It was their ketchup, their secret sauce, their olfactory war crime. Wine was mixed with water, never drunk straight because only barbarians did that. And as the night went on, the conversation would loosen up, the jokes would get dirtier, and someone would inevitably recite bad poetry. If you were lucky, you'd have musicians, dancers, or jugglers performing between courses. If you were unlucky, a philosopher might show up and start talking about virtue. The baths, or Rome's favorite social network. Before dinner, many Romans hit the public baths, thermae. And these weren't just places to get clean, they were social hubs, like a gym, a spa, and gossip lounge all rolled into one. There were rooms for hot baths, warm baths, and cold dips. There were also massage rooms, libraries, and snack bars because apparently even bathing required snacks. The entry fee was small, so almost everyone went, from senators to slaves. It was one of the few places where class boundaries softened a bit. You could argue politics, flirt, or just sit around sweating with strangers. The Romans believed bathing was essential to civilization. They even built bathhouses in far-off provinces like Britain, because nothing says cultural conquest like forcing people to adopt your hygiene schedule. Fashion, or when in Rome, wear linen and complain about it. Roman fashion was all about simplicity, or at least the illusion of it. Men wore tunics and togas for formal occasions. Women wore stole, long dresses often layered with colorful shawls. Makeup was big among upper-class women. They used white lead for foundation, because apparently, glowing skin was worth slow poisoning. They darkened their eyes with soot or antimony and tinted their lips with crushed beetles. Perfume? Imported from Arabia, of course. The more expensive, the better. And hairstyles. Oh, the hairstyles. In the imperial period, wealthy women wore towering curls and braids pinned with gold and pearls. Servants sometimes spent hours constructing these hair sculptures. Because when you're living in a city full of marble and ambition, your hair should also defy gravity. Let's drift away from the vanity table now and into the world of Roman entertainment. Because what's an empire without a few absurd pastimes? Entertainment, or blood, bread, and bad jokes. Romans loved entertainment, The louder, the bloodier, the better. The phrase panem and circenses, or bread and circuses, summed it up perfectly. Keep the people fed and distracted, and they won't notice the political corruption. Gladiator games were the main event. Held in huge arenas like the Colosseum, they featured trained fighters, often slaves or prisoners, battling each other or wild animals for the crowd's amusement. Now, not every match was to the death. That's a common myth. Many were staged, choreographed, or stopped when one fighter was clearly beaten. But yes, sometimes people did die, and the crowd loved it. There were also chariot races in the Circus Maximus, fast, dangerous, and wildly popular. Each team had fanatics, kind of like ancient sports hooligans, complete with riots and conspiracy theories. People would literally bet fortunes on their favorite color: blue, green, red, or white. And then there was theater. Roman plays borrowed heavily from the Greeks, but with more slapstick and less moral reflection. Actors wore masks, spoke loudly, and sometimes got heckled by the crowd. A good show could make your name, a bad one could get you booed off the stage with rotten fruit. And so, as the lamps burned low and the city quieted, Rome settled into its uneasy sleep. Dogs barked in the alleyways, water trickled through aqueducts, and someone, somewhere, was still debating politics. Because Rome never really slept. It just paused between scandals.
Roman family life, religion, and social hierarchies. So we wandered through the Roman streets, peeked into their kitchens, and survived dinner without choking on a peacock tongue. Let's get a little more personal tonight. We are sinking deeper now into the heart of Roman society, into the families, the beliefs, and the everyday relationships that held the whole imperial soap opera together, or at least duct taped it long enough for a few centuries of dysfunction. So get comfortable. Let's float into the Roman household, a place where obedience was mandatory, love was optional, and everyone was slightly afraid of grandma. The Roman family, or it's a patriarchy, darling. At the top of every Roman family stood the paterfamilialis, the oldest living male. He was the legal head of the household, the owner of everything, and essentially the family's mini emperor. His word was law. Literally, he had absolute authority over his children, his wife, his slaves, and even sometimes his married sons. He could approve marriages, disown children, and theoretically even execute family members, though, that tended to make dinner awkward. The Romans called this power patria potestas, the power of the father, and it was taken very seriously. Even a full-grown son serving as a consul or general might technically still be under his father's authority. So yes, imagine being 45, commanding a legion, and still having to ask dad's permission to buy a house. Roman adulthood was, let's say, negotiable. The Roman mother, or silent strength and strategic patience. Roman women didn't have much official power, but unofficially, they were often the quiet forces behind the curtain. A respectable Roman woman was expected to be modest, loyal, and industrious, but the clever ones knew how to bend the rules. Married women, matronae, managed the household, oversaw servants, arranged marriages, and subtly influenced politics through whispers and dinner parties. Think of them as the ancient version of social networkers, only with better jewelry. Legally, they were under the guardianship of their husbands or fathers, but in practice, wealthy women often managed their own finances and estates. Some even became business owners, land managers, or benefactors of temples. Roman men loved to talk about how pure and submissive their wives were, while those wives were busy running half the family empire. It's what we might call quiet power, or, if you're Cicero, deeply unsettling. Marriage, or arranged, recycled, and occasionally romantic. Roman marriage wasn't exactly about love. It was about alliance, inheritance, and making sure your children had the right nose shape for political advancement. Most marriages were arranged, sometimes when the bride was barely a teenager. The husband might be twice her age or more, which was considered fine because, well, Rome. Weddings were elaborate affairs. There was a veil, a feast, a symbolic joining of hands, and then the bride was literally carried into her husband's house, not for romance, but to signify she was now part of his family property portfolio. Divorce, though, was surprisingly easy. Either party could simply say, "Tuas res tibi habeto," take your things and go. And just like that, it was over. By the late Republic and early Empire, divorces were almost trendy. Some aristocrats changed spouses like tunics, often for political reasons, sometimes just for boredom. Emperor Augustus famously tried to crack down on moral decay, which was bold considering his own daughter was sleeping with half of Rome.
Children, or small, loud symbols of family legacy. Children were both precious and practical. They carried on the family name and ideally didn't die too young, which was a real challenge in ancient Rome. When a baby was born, it was placed at the father's feet. If he picked it up, it was accepted into the family. If not, it could be abandoned or given away. Yes, cheerful times. Wealthy families might hire Greek tutors to educate their children, especially sons. They learned reading, writing, rhetoric, and philosophy, the standard toolkit for future senators or insufferable dinner guests. Girls, meanwhile, were taught domestic skills, spinning, sewing, and how to look graceful while obeying orders. Though, again, wealthy Roman women often turned out surprisingly well educated. Many could read Greek literature, manage estates, and debate politics, but, quietly. Children were expected to respect their parents, especially the father. Family portraits lined the atrium, reminding everyone of their ancestors, all those stern marble faces silently judging your life choices. Slavery, or the backbone no one wanted to acknowledge. Slavery was everywhere in Rome. Everywhere. Slaves cooked the meals, cleaned the houses, taught the children, farmed the land, and fought in the arenas. They were the invisible machinery that kept the empire running, and they came from everywhere Rome conquered. Greece, Gaul, Egypt, Britain, you name it. Some slaves were treated decently and could earn their freedom. Others lived miserable lives in mines or farms, with conditions so brutal that even Roman writers occasionally went, maybe this is a bit much. Freed slaves, liberti, often stayed loyal to their former masters, working as clients, assistants, or business partners. Many became quite wealthy. Roman society was rigid, but not entirely without mobility. If you were smart, shrewd, and lucky, you could climb, slowly, out of slavery and into respectability. Still, most Romans saw slavery as natural, even necessary. It's one of those uncomfortable truths that sits at the heart of ancient grandeur. The more beautiful the marble villa, the more human hands had built it without choice. Class and status, or a very complicated ladder. Roman society was obsessed with hierarchy. Everything had its rank, from senators to slaves, gods to street vendors. At the top were the patricians, old aristocratic families who liked to remind everyone they were descended from the founders of Rome. Below them were the equites, or knights, the wealthy business class who pretended they weren't jealous of the patricians. Then came the plebeians, the commoners. And below that, the freedmen, and finally, the slaves. Everyone knew their place, and everyone was trying somehow to climb just one rung higher. Patricians flaunted their status with purple togas and fancy rings. Plebeians might join the army or start a business to earn citizenship privileges. And freedmen made their mark by funding public buildings, an early version of slopping your name on a library for clout. Rome thrived on this constant push for prestige. Every triumphal arch, every public bath, every temple inscription, it was all part of the same competitive ego parade. The gods, or divine bureaucracy Roman edition. Now let's wander into the temples. Religion in Rome wasn't about personal faith, it was about keeping the gods on your good side, which was tricky because there were a lot of them. The Romans had a god for everything:
doors, thresholds, childbirth, boundaries, wine, even mold. They believed that every part of life had a divine counterpart watching over it, and if you forgot to pay proper respect, well, things could go downhill fast. Jupiter was the big boss, ruling over the sky and thunder. Juno watched over marriage and childbirth. Minerva handled wisdom and crafts, and then there was Mars, the god of war, because Rome loved to give war its own deity. Temples dotted the city, each dedicated to a specific god, each staffed by priests who were more bureaucrats than mystics. You didn't pray to connect with the divine. You prayed to make sure your crops didn't die and your house didn't catch fire. Rituals had to be performed perfectly. Any mistake and you'd have to start over. It was religion by checklist. Even the emperor was considered semi-divine, though depending on the emperor, that was either inspiring or mildly terrifying. Festivals, or excuses to party in the name of piety. Romans loved festivals. They had one for almost every day of the year. If there wasn't a festival, someone probably invented one. There was Saturnalia, the famous December festival of role reversal and gift-giving. Slaves dined with masters, people wore silly hats, and public drunkenness was not only accepted but encouraged. It was basically Roman Christmas meets Mardi Gras, minus the caroling. Then there was Lupercalia, the fertility festival. Young men ran around wearing goat skins and whipping people with strips of hide for good luck. Because, of course they did. Nothing says love and fertility than a light flogging from a half-dressed teenager. Other festivals honored gods of the harvest, the dead, or the city's founding. Each one involved processions, sacrifices, games, and lots of food. It wasn't so much about faith as it was about community, and the collective hope that maybe, just maybe, the gods would stay in a good mood. Death and the afterlife, or, when in doubt, build a tomb. The Romans were pragmatic about death. They believed the dead lingered among the living, and that proper burial was essential to keep them content. Cemeteries lined the roads outside the city walls, filled with elaborate tombs decorated with portraits and inscriptions. Even freedmen saved up for these, because immortality in Rome meant being remembered. Funerals could be modest or extravagant. The wealthy hired professional mourners, musicians, and sometimes even actors to impersonate ancestors. It was both solemn and slightly theatrical, which feels about right for Rome. They didn't have a single unified view of the afterlife. Some believed in a shadowy underworld, others in a kind of spiritual survival through memory. But everyone agreed that ghosts, manes, should be kept appeased with offerings. You wouldn't want to make grandma's ghost angry. And as evening fell over the city, families gathered again, lighting oil lamps, telling stories, and maybe whispering a little gossip about the senator next door. The empire stretched far and wide, but daily life remained simple in its rhythms. Eat, work, pray, gossip, repeat. Beneath the marble and military glory, Rome was just people. Flawed, funny, ambitious, occasionally unwashed people. Trying, like all of us, to make their way through the days without annoying too many gods or neighbors.
Work, leisure, and the everyday grind of the Roman Empire. So far, we've seen Rome's homes, families, and feasts, all the marble, manners, and mild dysfunction that made up daily life. But beneath the banquets and philosophy lectures, the empire actually had to function. Someone had to build the roads, make the sandals, catch the fish, and sweep up after all those bread and circuses. Tonight, we're gliding through the working world of ancient Rome. The laborers, merchants, craftsmen, and hustlers who kept the eternal city eternally busy. And then, of course, we'll balance it out with what they did to unwind, which, spoiler alert, often involved alcohol and shouting. So, dim the lights, and let's stroll through the forum once more. This time, not as aristocrats, but as ordinary Romans just trying to make a living. The Roman workday, or rise, sweat, repeat. For most Romans, life wasn't glamorous. The average citizen, the plebeian, worked long hours doing whatever needed doing. Farmers rose before dawn, heading out to the fields with tools that hadn't changed much since the Bronze Age. City laborers might head to construction sites, carrying bricks, mixing mortar, and hoping their foreman wasn't in a bad mood. Craftsmen opened their workshops, blacksmiths, potters, leatherworkers, each trade forming a small, tight-knit guild known as a collegium. Shops were tiny, often just open-fronted rooms on the street level of insulae. You'd live in the back and sell from the front, a kind of ancient live-work loft, minus the plumbing. The Roman workday typically ran from sunrise until around 2 p.m. when the heat became unbearable. Then came the afternoon rest, a habit that feels suspiciously like the modern siesta, and honestly, they were onto something. The farmers, or Rome's reluctant backbone. Rome loved to talk about the virtue of farmers. Politicians like Cincinnatus were glorified for their simple agrarian lifestyles, though, conveniently, most of those praising farmers were rich enough to have other people doing the farming for them. Still, agriculture was the foundation of Roman life. The countryside was dotted with villae rusticae, country estates that combined comfortable living with large-scale production. Wheat, olives, and grapes were the holy trinity of Roman agricultural. Wheat fed the masses, olives made the oil, and grapes made everyone forget about everything else. Farmers used plows drawn by oxen, harvested grain by hand, and relied heavily on slave labor. A good harvest could make you rich, a bad one could make you desperate. And given the Roman tendency for droughts, floods, and tax collectors, desperation was a frequent visitor. But for all the hardship, the Romans idealized the countryside. Poets wrote lovingly about the simple farm life, fresh air, honest work, rustic dinners, conveniently ignoring the mosquitoes, back pain, and manure. Merchants and traders, or capitalism, but make it toga-friendly. While the old Roman elite looked down on trade, calling it unseemly, they were more than happy to profit from it, through middlemen, of course. Merchants were essential. They brought goods from across the empire, Egyptian grain, Spanish olive oil, Syrian glass, and silk from mysterious lands even beyond Persia. Ports like Ostia buzzed with activity. Warehouses, taverns, and moneylenders crowded the docks, and the smell was vivid. Ships unloaded amphoras filled with wine and oil, then took back Roman pottery and processed goods to sell elsewhere. Merchants used coins stamped with the emperor's face, a nice reminder that every deal somehow benefited the state. Taxes were collected, tariffs applied, and records kept by an army of scribes who probably had the world's worst handwriting. And while many merchants were freedmen rather than nobles, some became incredibly wealthy. A few even funded temples or amphitheaters, hoping that civic generosity might outweigh their non-aristocratic origins. Artisans, or the quiet artists behind the marble. Rome was full of skilled hands. Potters, weavers, sculptors, and builders shaped the material world of the empire. Brickmakers produced the literal building blocks of the city. Mosaic artists crafted intricate floors that still dazzle today, made from thousands of tiny tiles. Patience was mandatory, sanity optional. Stonecutters carved statues of gods, emperors, and anyone rich enough to pay for immortality. Even small items, jewelry, hairpins, oil lamps, showed artistry. Roman design balanced function and flair, whether it was a bronze cooking pan or a gold bracelet shaped like a snake. Many workshops were family businesses, passed down through generations. A father would teach his sons the trade, and the daughters would help with sales, proving once again that behind every empire were people just trying to pay rent. Public workers, or civic duty, Roman style. Rome was also full of publicani, state contractors, who built and maintained infrastructure. They constructed aqueducts, repaired roads, and managed tax collection, which, yes, often meant extortion with a smile. Then there were the vigiles, Rome's version of firefighters and night watchmen. They patrolled the streets after dark, extinguished fires, and occasionally arrested troublemakers. It was a respectable job if you didn't mind the constant smell of smoke and the risk of bricks falling on your head. Other essential workers included water engineers, sewer cleaners, and grave diggers, jobs no one glorified but everyone needed, because someone had to keep the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, flowing. and with a name like that, it definitely deserved a little respect. The markets, or chaos, commerce, and chickens. The beating heart of Rome's economy was its markets, noisy, crowded, and aromatic. The Forum Boarium sold cattle, the Forum Holatorium sold vegetables, and the Macellum offered meat and fish. Vendors shouted prices, haggled aggressively, and sometimes watered down their wine or cheated on weights, a time-honored tradition of retail everywhere. Money changers sat at small wooden tables, clinking coins and muttering calculations. Children ran errands, dogs begged for scraps, and pickpockets practiced their craft on distracted shoppers. And then there were the tabernae, small shops selling bread, garum, cheese, or hot food. For most Romans, these were their restaurants. You'd grab a quick bite, maybe a bowl of lentils or a sausage, and gossip while leaning on the counter. It wasn't glamorous, but it was lively. And if you were lucky, the stew wouldn't taste too strongly of yesterday's.
The Roman work ethic, or work hard, brag harder. Romans respected hard work, in theory. In practice, manual labor was considered beneath the elite. Senators liked to claim they owned farms, but rarely touched a plow themselves. True virtue, they said, was found in politics, philosophy, or military service, all conveniently prestigious and well-paid. Still, the ideal of industry, diligence, and effort ran deep in Roman culture. Whether you were a craftsman or a commander, you were expected to put your all into your work. Lazy people were mocked, often in public. Roman writers loved moralizing about how softness led to decline, while dictating these complaints from their bathhouses. Leisure, or how to waste time elegantly. Now, once the workday ended and the sun cooled, Romans turned to leisure, and honestly, they were experts at it. For the wealthy, leisure meant time for philosophy, reading, or writing long letters about virtue to people they secretly disliked. They hosted dinner parties, attended poetry recitals, or visited their country villas to get away from the city, which usually meant gossiping with the same people and better scenery. For everyone else, leisure was simpler. You might stroll through the market, visit the baths, gamble with dice, or grab a drink at a popina, a kind of tavern that was equal parts pub and chaos. Gambling was technically frowned upon, but almost everyone did it. Board games, dice, and knucklebones were favorites. Winners gloated, losers swore eternal vengeance. Nothing changes. The Roman tavern, or where civilization gets loud. Roman taverns were lively, smoky, and slightly dangerous. They served cheap wine, stews, and occasionally stolen goods. Men of all classes, except the very noble, might mingle here. Soldiers, sailors, merchants, freedmen. Arguments were common, fights occasional. The poet Juvenal complained that taverns were full of shameless drunks and noisy women, which, let's be honest, probably means they were fun. Wine came in every variety, from fine vintage Falernian to something resembling vinegar. It was always diluted with water and sometimes flavored with herbs or honey to mask the questionable quality. A night in a tavern might end with singing, laughter, or sleeping face down on the table. All three were acceptable outcomes. The Roman holidays, or because even empires need a break. Rome had more public holidays than actual work days at certain points. Religious festivals, imperial anniversaries, and military triumphs filled the calendar. Games, or ludi, were held to celebrate these occasions. Chariot races, theatrical performances, and even mock naval battles. Citizens packed the amphitheaters, waving banners and placing bets. Vendors sold snacks, and emperors handed out free bread to keep everyone happy. These events were social glue, a way for the people to feel connected to their empire. They also gave emperors a chance to show generosity, or at least to distract the public from their latest political scandal. As long as the games kept coming, Rome stayed calm. Panem and circenses, bread and circuses, still one of history's most efficient management strategies. The artists and writers, or the thinkers who couldn't stop complaining. Rome also had its intellectuals, poets, historians, philosophers, the ones who filled scrolls with observations about society, decadence, and mortal decay. Poets like Ovid, Virgil, and Horace wrote of love, heroism, and the occasional scandal.
Historians like Livy and Tacitus chronicled Rome's rise and its endless corruption, in prose so elegant it almost made betrayal sound noble. For philosophers, patronage was key. You needed a wealthy sponsor to survive. And if that meant flattering your patron in verse, well, dignity was negotiable. Still, their work outlived them. Long after their villas crumbled, their words kept whispering through the centuries, a reminder that even in Rome, people liked to sit around complaining about society. As night deepened, the city would quiet again. Shop shutters closed, torches flickered in alleyways, somewhere a dog barked, a poet sighed dramatically, and a few taverns were still very much alive. Work and leisure, the pulse of Roman life. Sweat by day, laughter by night. An empire built not only by emperors, but by bakers, masons, and market women who'd never see their names on marble. And yet, their fingerprints are everywhere. In every cobblestone, every worn stair, every ruin that still stands.
Health, hygiene, and the pursuit of Roman beauty. So far, we've eaten, worked, and lounged our way through the empire, all while pretending not to notice how much fermented fish sauce was involved. But tonight, let's talk about something a little more personal. Because for all their marble temples and philosophical musings, the Romans were still human. They got sick, they aged badly, they had weird beauty trends, and they were forever trying to smell a little less like the city they lived in. And considering what Rome smelled like on a summer afternoon, that was an uphill battle. So dim the lights, maybe light a candle, and let's float through the Roman world of health, hygiene, and all the questionable remedies that came before modern medicine existed. Health in Rome. Or, we're not dying, we're just declining gracefully. Let's start with the basics. Ancient Roman medicine. It was a mix of Greek science, superstition, and guesswork, sometimes brilliant, sometimes tragic, and sometimes both at once. Doctors existed, of course, medici, but the quality of your care depended entirely on your wallet. The rich could afford Greek-trained physicians, many of whom had studied Hippocrates and Galen. The poor mostly relied on herbalists, midwives, or whoever in the neighborhood claimed to know about leeches. Roman doctors did have some solid ideas. They knew about diet, exercise, and hygiene. They performed minor surgeries with surprisingly advanced tools, scalpels, forceps, even bone saws. They understood wound cleaning, though not bacteria, which led to predictable outcomes. And then there were the not-so-great ideas, like using pigeon droppings for ear infections, or believing that drinking gladiator blood could cure epilepsy. It's unclear whether that worked, but it definitely boosted the black market demand for dead gladiators. Galen, or the man who thought he knew everything, and mostly did. No discussion of Roman health is complete without mentioning Galen, the celebrity doctor of the 2nd CE. He treated emperors, wrote over 400 books, and never once admitted to being wrong about anything. Galen believed in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, he said, was all about balance. Too much of one humor, and you got sick. The cure? Adjust your diet, purge, bleed, or vomit, until balance was restored. It sounds bizarre now, but this theory ruled Western medicine for nearly 1,500 years. So if you've ever wondered who to thank for centuries of medieval bloodletting, it's Galen. Congratulations. Still, for his time, he was sharp. He performed animal dissections, studied anatomy, and documented illnesses in detail. He was also spectacularly arrogant, but to be fair, that seems to have been a job requirement in Rome. Hospitals and healing, or lie down, try not to die. Rome's version of hospitals were called valledunaria, mainly built for soldiers. The military valued health. After all, an army of sick men can't conquer much. These facilities had organized wards, basic sanitation, and even surgical rooms. For civilians, though, medical care usually happened at home. Wealthy families had their own doctors or household slaves trained in medicine. Everyone else relied on prayers, poultices, and luck.
Roman women gave birth at home, assisted by midwives who knew far more about the human body than most men in togas. Mortality rates were high, but Roman society took that in stride. Stoicism wasn't just a philosophy, it was a survival strategy. Public health, or plumbing before plumbing was cool. If there's one thing the Romans actually nailed, it's public health infrastructure. Their aqueducts were marvels of engineering, carrying clean water for miles into cities, feeding fountains, baths, and homes. It was like an ancient water grid without the modern billing disputes. Public baths, while not exactly sterile, helped keep people cleaner than most ancient societies. Sewers like the Cloaca Maxima drained wastewater into the Tiber, reducing disease and increasing the smell downstream. Streets were paved, drains built, and public toilets installed, which, as we discussed earlier, those toilets were communal and intimate. Hygiene was a public affair. A man might gossip, relieve himself, and make business deals all in one bathroom visit. It was multitasking at its most Roman. Personal hygiene, or soap is for barbarians, pass the oil. Despite their plumbing prowess, Romans didn't use soap the way we do. Instead, they cleaned themselves with olive oil. At the bath, they'd slather olive oil all over their bodies, then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. It removed sweat, dirt, and whatever else had accumulated during a day in a city of 1 million people. Did it work? Sort of. You'd be shiny at least. Perfumes and scented oils were everywhere. Men and women both used them, some delicate, others strong enough to fumigate a small apartment. Roman authors constantly complained that people wore too much perfume, which, knowing Rome, was probably true. Toothpaste? That existed too. Some recipes used crushed bones or oyster shells mixed with charcoal and urine. Yes, urine. Ammonia, they said, kept your teeth white. They weren't wrong, just horrifyingly right.
Hair and beauty, or high maintenance, low mercy. Roman beauty standards were ruthless. Fair skin, shiny hair, smooth limbs, all symbols of wealth and refinement. Because if you were pale, it meant you didn't have to work outside, which was the ancient version of saying, I have generational wealth. Women's beauty routines were serious business. Face masks made from honey, milk, and sometimes crocodile dung were common. Lead-based foundation gave a ghostly pallor that slowly poisoned you, but, worth it for the aesthetic. Kohl darkened the eyes, rouge colored the cheeks, and wigs, often imported from Germany or India, completed the look. Hair was curled, piled high, and pinned with gold or ivory combs. The more elaborate your hair, the higher your social status, and probably the number of servants cursing your name. Men weren't immune to vanity either. Beards went in and out of fashion depending on the emperor's facial hair of choice. Nero's reign, for instance, brought back the chin sculpting craze, because if Nero did it, everyone had to, whether it looked good or not. Fitness, or Roman gym bro energy. Physical fitness was important, especially for men. Romans admired the athletic ideal, strength, discipline, balance. But unlike the Greeks, they weren't obsessed with nude sports competitions, thankfully. The baths doubled as fitness centers. You could wrestle, play ball games, lift weights made of stone, or just flex dramatically while pretending to stretch. The military, of course, provided the most rigorous exercise. Marching 20 miles a day in full armor tended to keep you in shape. For women, the idea of fitness was more delicate. Light exercises like dancing or gentle stretching were acceptable, enough to stay gracious, but not enough to look muscular. A strong woman was admirable in mythology, but slightly alarming in real life. Medicine at home, or Grandma's Remedies Roman edition. Every Roman household had its own stash of home remedies, passed down from generations or borrowed from whatever Greek text was trending. Cough? Drink honey with pepper. Headache? Rub crushed laurel leaves on your temples. Insomnia? Eat lettuce. Snakebite? Try wine, and if that fails, write your will. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, and mint were used for everything from digestion to divine protection. And while some cures were nonsense, others actually worked. Honey, for instance, was used as an antiseptic, and garlic as a general health booster. Of course, superstition always had a seat at the table.
Amulets, prayers, and lucky charms were common supplements to any treatment, because even if the doctor was useless, maybe Jupiter was listening. The Roman body, or a temple, a tool, and occasionally a tragedy. Romans had a complicated relationship with the human body. On the one hand, they worshipped physical perfection, sculpted athletes, marble gods, smooth statues that glowed with idealized health. On the other, real bodies were constantly tested by war, disease, and daily labor. Injuries were common. Legionaries carried scars as badges of honor. Farmers bore the marks of endless toil. And the poor, cramped and insulae, exposed to smoke and sewage, aged faster than their wealthier counterparts. Still, the Romans celebrated resilience. Writers like Seneca preached calm acceptance of illness and pain, insisting that true virtue came from endurance, which is convenient for a society that didn't have antibiotics. Doctors, quacks, and philosophers. Not all doctors were equal. Some were geniuses, others were barely above snake oil salesmen. Rome had plenty of medical frauds, men who promised miracle cures for gout, baldness, or heartbreak, usually involving expensive imported herbs and long disclaimers. But Romans didn't entirely separate medicine from philosophy. Health wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul too. A calm mind, they said, kept the body in harmony, which is a poetic way of saying, try not to have a nervous breakdown in front of your slaves. Even emperors got in on the wellness trend. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, famously wrote meditations on staying mentally steady amid chaos. They're basically the ancient version of a mindfulness podcast, minus the sponsorships. The smell of Rome, or an honest assessment. No matter how much oil or perfume you used, ancient Rome did not smell good. You had 1 million people, no modern sanitation, and a diet that involved fish sauce and goats. Street vendors fried food in the open air, chamber pots emptied out of upper windows, sewers overflowed in the rain, and perfume competed valiantly against it all, like a rosebush planted next to a landfill. Visitors from the provinces often wrote about the city's energy, grandeur, and overwhelming odor, usually in that order. But Romans got used to it, the same way we've gotten used to traffic fumes and bad Wi-Fi. Every civilization has its trade-offs. Death by lifestyle, or Rome's real silent killers. With all this in mind, how long did the average Roman live? Well, not long. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years. Child mortality was high, disease rampant, and medical care inconsistent at best. But that average hides some nuance. If you survived childhood and didn't die in war, you could live into your 60s or even 70s. Diet played a role. Wealthy Romans ate too well. Lots of fatty meats and wine. Poor Romans didn't eat enough, mostly grain, beans, and hope. Both extremes led to health problems. Add in lead poisoning from pipes and cookware, plus questionable hygiene practices, and it's a wonder anyone lived long enough to invent Latin grammar. Beauty, mortality, and the eternal facade. Still, the Romans clung fiercely to beauty and vitality, not just for vanity's sake, but because it symbolized control. In a world full of plagues, fires, and floods, looking put together was a small defiance against chaos. They decorated their bodies like their homes, polished, perfumed, idealized. And when time eventually won, they carved their faces into marble, freezing themselves forever at their most flattering angle. Because if you couldn't live forever, at least you could look like you might have. And as the lamps flickered in the twilight, a Roman might stand before their polished bronze mirror, adjusting their curls, dabbing on oil, and sighing at the reflection of an empire in miniature. Strong, imperfect, mortal, and still very concerned about skin tone. Because even in the heart of the greatest empire on earth, some things never change.
Roman education, philosophy, and the life of the mind. Hey everyone, welcome back. So far, we've wandered through Roman food, fashion, entertainment, and hygiene, and somehow survived the fish sauce, the lead pipes, and the public toilets. Tonight, let's move into something a little quieter. Something that takes us into the marble halls and shaded courtyards where the Romans tried to think great thoughts, and occasionally succeeded. This is the world of Roman education and philosophy, where young boys memorized Homer before they could tie their sandals,
and senators debated moral virtue while plotting political assassinations. It's all very lofty, very civilized, and, as always, just a little ridiculous underneath. So get comfortable. Maybe pour a cup of warm milk, or wine if you're feeling historically accurate, and let's drift into the intellectual life of ancient Rome. Learning the Roman way, or grammar, whips, and endless recitation. Education in Rome wasn't exactly about self-expression or creativity. It was about discipline, memory, and showing off how Greek you could sound in public. School started early. Wealthy boys, and sometimes girls, though not often, were sent to private tutors or small local schools called ludi. The first stage focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic. Think of it as the Roman version of primary school, but with wax tablets instead of iPads, and teachers who didn't believe in positive reinforcement. The literator, the elementary teacher, was often a freedman or an enslaved Greek intellectual. He taught the basics by repetition and example. Students copied letters on wax tablets with styluses, erased them, and did it again, over and over. For years. If you made mistakes, you were hit. If you didn't make mistakes, you were probably still hit. Corporal punishment was considered an essential teaching tool. In fact, the phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" would have gotten a standing ovation in any Roman classroom. The next level, or grammar school, but make it Greek. Once you could read and write, you moved on to the grammaticus. This was where things got serious and expensive. You learned literature, poetry, and mythology, mostly Greek, because Roman elites were obsessed with Greece. To them, Greek culture was the pinnacle of refinement. Roman students read Homer, Euripides, and Plato, sometimes in translation, but the best families made sure their kids learned fluent Greek. A well-educated Roman could quote both Virgil and Aristotle while reclining at dinner, which was the ancient version of being really good at TED Talks. But it wasn't just reading. Students analyzed grammar, memorized speeches, and practiced reciting lines dramatically. Education was performance. You weren't just learning, you were preparing to impress your social circle with your cultured eloquence. The reader, or how to argue for a living. The final stage of education was rhetoric, the art of persuasion. This was taught by the reader, often the most respected teacher in the city, and for good reason. In Rome, words were power. If you could speak well, you could rise politically, socially, and financially. Law, politics, and even warfare relied on speech. Being eloquent was like having a sword made of vocabulary. Students studied famous orators like Cicero and Demosthenes. They learned to argue both sides of an issue, a skill that would later serve senators perfectly when lying to each other in the forum. Lessons included practice speeches called declamationes, where students argued hypothetical cases. Example, should a son be allowed to prosecute his own father for treason? The point wasn't the answer, it was showing off how elegantly you could say, it's complicated. And while girls rarely studied rhetoric, some elite women did receive private tutoring. A few, like Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi brothers, were celebrated for their intellect and speech. But for the most part, Roman education was designed for the men who would go on to run the empire, or at least pretend to. Libraries and literacy, or scrolls, ink, and the eternal search for decent lighting. Rome loved books, though by books we mean scrolls. Parchment and papyrus scrolls filled libraries across the empire. The wealthy built personal collections, showing them off like trophies. Reading wasn't just an activity, it was a lifestyle aesthetic. Public libraries existed too, though not as cozy as modern ones. They were usually quiet, solemn spaces lined with busts of philosophers, the kind of place you'd feel guilty sneezing. Literacy was widespread among the elite, but rare among the poor. Scribes and slaves handled much of the writing. Still, graffiti across Pompeii shows that even commoners could scrawl messages, insults, or love notes when motivated enough. Romans read everything: poetry, philosophy, histories, love letters, astrology, cookbooks, and scandalous gossip scrolls. And if that sounds familiar, it's because human nature doesn't really change. We just replace scrolls with smartphones.
Philosophy, or how to stay calm while everything burns. Now let's talk about the Roman approach to philosophy, which, like everything else, they borrowed from the Greeks, and then repackaged with their own spin. Romans didn't invent philosophy, but they made it practical. They didn't care much for abstract theories about the cosmos. They wanted to know how to live a good life, or at least how to survive Nero's dinner parties without losing their sanity. The big schools of thought in Rome were Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism. Each had its fan club.
Stoicism, or the emotional support philosophy of the empire. Let's start with Stoicism, Rome's favorite brand of mental discipline. If you've ever tried to stay calm and carry on, congratulations, you're basically doing ancient Stoicism. Stoics believed in self-control, rationality, and accepting fate. The universe, they said, was governed by reason, logos, and everything happened as it should. So your job wasn't to fight fate, but to maintain inner peace no matter what. That sounds noble until you remember this was also a coping mechanism for living under emperors like Nero or Caligula. When life hands you tyrants, make philosophy. Famous Roman Stoics included Seneca the Younger, tutor to Nero, philosopher, playwright, and reluctant participant in his own forced suicide. Seneca's writings are full of calm wisdom and thinly disguised anxiety about being murdered by his boss. Then there was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor himself. His meditations read like the diary of a man trying very hard not to have a breakdown while ruling the known world. He reminded himself daily to stay humble, avoid anger, and remember that all things are temporary, including his patience. Epicureanism, or don't panic, just enjoy dinner. If Stoicism was about self-denial, Epicureanism was about controlled pleasure. Founded by the Greek philosopher Epicurus, it taught that the goal of life was happiness, but not in a wild party-all-night way. Epicureans valued simple joys: friendship, peace, moderate food, and freedom from fear. They believed that pleasure came from the absence of pain, not endless indulgence. So yes, they liked wine, but not hangovers. They liked company, but not drama. Basically, they were the minimalists of ancient philosophy. In Rome, Epicureanism appealed to those tired of constant political chaos. Its focus on inner tranquility made it a quiet rebellion against ambition and greed, which naturally meant ambitious and greedy people often mocked it as laziness. Skepticism, or maybe nothing is real, and that's fine. Then there were the skeptics, philosophers who took a look at everyone else's certainty and said, are we sure? They questioned whether knowledge was ever truly possible. If our senses can deceive us and reason can be flawed, how can we ever know anything for certain? It was a bit of an intellectual downer, but oddly comforting. When surrounded by superstitions, politics, and philosophical egos, skepticism offered a mental shrug, a healthy maybe, in a world full of definitelys. Education for women, or smart but not too smart. Women weren't officially barred from learning, but cultural expectations kept them in the background. They were expected to run households, not debate in the forum. Still, wealthy families often educated their daughters privately, teaching them to read, write, and manage finances. Some women became poets, philosophers, and historians. Cornelia, as mentioned, was famed for her eloquence. Julia Balbilla left graffiti poems on Egyptian monuments that still survive. And Hypatia of Alexandria, though later, during the empire's decline, became one of antiquity's greatest mathematicians and teachers.
But generally speaking, Roman men preferred their wives well-mannered, literate enough to read love letters, and not inclined to correct them publicly. Roman thinkers and writers, or brains behind the bronze. The Roman intellectual landscape was full of interesting personalities. Cicero, the orator, lawyer, and philosopher, wrote endless treatises on ethics, law, and rhetoric, all while complaining about everyone else's incompetence. He believed deeply in the Republic, which was inconvenient since it died while he was watching. Still, his speeches became the blueprint for persuasive language for centuries. Pliny the Elder, meanwhile, wrote The Natural History, a sprawling encyclopedia that covered everything from astronomy to herbal remedies. It was half scientific observation, half fever dream, but it became one of the most read books in the ancient world. Then there was Lucretius, the poet-philosopher, who wrote On the Nature of Things, an Epicurean masterpiece about atoms, nature, and the meaning of existence. It's beautiful, profound, and slightly depressing. In other words, very Roman. The Roman mindset, or practical idealists with a side of cynicism. Romans weren't dreamers in the Greek sense. They admired philosophy, but they didn't want to live in a cave pondering the cosmos. They wanted wisdom that could be applied to politics, war, or dinner conversation. Their philosophy was pragmatic, moralistic, and deeply tied to civic duty. The good life wasn't just about personal peace, it was about serving Rome honorably. Virtue, justice, and self-discipline were constant themes. Of course, the same senators preaching virtue often accepted bribes and arranged assassinations. But hypocrisy, too, was part of the Roman experience. They knew their ideals were impossible, and they chased them anyway. Dreams, omens, and superstitions, or logic has its limits. For all their education and reason, Romans never quite let go of superstitions. They still believed in omens, augurs, and prophetic dreams. Before major decisions, generals watched birds for divine approval, because nothing says military precision than consulting a flock of geese. Philosophers debated fate, but even they kept household gods. A Roman might quote Stoic philosophy by day and whisper a prayer to Fortuna at night, just in case. It wasn't a contradiction, it was insurance. The daily life of the mind. For educated Romans, the day might begin with reading or writing. Letters were an art form, carefully composed, elegant, full of rhetorical flair. Friends exchanged essays disguised as correspondence. Even gossip was written with impeccable grammar. Afternoons were for debate, lectures, or teaching one's own children. Evenings might include a small reading circle or poetry recitation, where someone inevitably compared themselves to Virgil. The Roman intellectual scene was part philosophy, part performance. Thinking as legacy. Knowledge to the Romans was immortal. Marble crumbled, empires fell, but words, they believed, could outlast death. That's why they wrote so much. Why they copied scrolls, commissioned libraries, and inscribed ideas into stone. For a people obsessed with legacy, thought was the ultimate monument. Not the grandest, perhaps, but the most enduring. And so, as the Roman night deepened, torches flickering, scrolls rolled and tied, a scholar might look out over the silent city and think, maybe the gods don't care, maybe fate is indifferent, but we can still learn, write, and understand. Because in the end, that was Rome's truest form of worship. Not gold or sacrifice, but thought itself.
The gods of Rome, an everyday religion. So far, we've walked through Roman food, baths, beauty, philosophy, and that unfortunate tooth cleaning habit involving urine. But tonight, we're lighting a few metaphorical candles and heading into the realm of Roman religion, a world full of gods, rituals, sacrifices, omens, and just enough superstition to make the whole empire slightly paranoid. So get cozy, let the noise of the day fade out, and imagine you're sitting in a quiet Roman courtyard at dusk. The air smells faintly of incense and olive oil. Somewhere, a priest is chanting in Latin you can barely understand, and you're quietly hoping the gods don't notice you've skipped a few offerings lately. Let's float, gently, into the divine chaos of ancient Rome. The Roman Pantheon, or everyone's invited, apparently. Rome didn't just have gods, it had so many gods. Hundreds, maybe thousands, depending on how you count. Every aspect of life had a divine supervisor. There were major gods, minor gods, household gods, and gods that existed solely to oversee extremely specific tasks. You had Jupiter, the king of the gods, basically Zeus in a new outfit. Juno, his wife, who handled marriage and jealousy, often simultaneously. Minerva for wisdom, Mars for war, Venus for love, Neptune for the sea, and so on. Then you had smaller, more specialized deities. There was Forculus, who guarded doors, Cardeia, who looked after hinges, even Limentinus, the god of thresholds. Yes, in Rome, you could literally pray to the god of doorframes, because nothing says divine efficiency like an empire with the 3-part hinge protection plan. Borrowing from everyone, or if you can't beat them, add their gods. One of the reasons Rome had so many gods is that it never met a foreign religion it didn't like, or at least didn't eventually absorb. When the Romans conquered new lands, they often adopted local deities, renamed them, and folded them into their pantheon. It was imperialism with a touch of cultural flexibility. Greek gods became Roman ones. Egyptian Isis gained a cult following in Rome. Persian Mithras became the center of a mysterious all-male military cult. Even Celtic and Germanic gods found Roman equivalents after a few interpretive translations. It was less religious tolerance and more corporate merger. Everyone got a desk in the divine office, but Jupiter still ran the meetings. Rituals, or do it right or else. Roman religion wasn't about faith or personal belief, it was about ritual. The Romans cared less about what you believed and more about whether you performed the ceremony correctly. They called this Pax Diorum, the peace of the gods. It was a contract. Humans kept the rituals precise, and the gods kept the universe running smoothly. Sacrifices were a big deal. Animals were offered to the gods, usually sheep, pigs, or bulls, while priests prayed in highly formal language. If a word was mispronounced, the whole ceremony had to start over. Imagine doing that in front of an impatient senator and a bleeding goat. The animal's entrails, particularly the liver, were examined by priests known as haruspices for omens, because nothing says spiritual insight like staring into the guts of livestock. The household gods, or meet the tiny guardians in your kitchen. Religion wasn't just for temples, it lived in every Roman home. Each family had their lares and penates, small guardian spirits of the household and pantry. Yes, even your leftover grain had divine protection. Their little statues stood in a shrine near the kitchen, decorated with garlands or offerings. Each morning, the family would greet them with prayers and bits of food. It was like a cross between ancestor worship and feeding your spiritual goldfish. The genius, another household spirit, represented the divine essence of the family head. Romans believed everyone had their own genius, a kind of personal guardian or life force. It's where we get the word genius today, though the modern version doesn't usually accept sacrifices of wine and cake. Temples and priests, or where bureaucracy meets the divine. Public worship was just as organized as the Roman military, with ranks, offices, and plenty of paperwork. Priests were government officials as much as holy men. Religion was a state affair, and every major temple doubled as a civic institution. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, was one of the most prestigious political titles in Rome. Later, emperors held the title themselves just to make sure the gods stayed in line. Temples were everywhere, each dedicated to a specific deity. They weren't cozy places for meditation, more like public monuments where you dropped off offerings and hoped for cosmic attention. Behind the scenes, a whole class of priestly specialists handled the details. Arguers who interpreted omens and bird flights, haruspices who examined animal organs,
Flamines, priests devoted to specific gods, sometimes with bizarre dress codes. One high priest, the Flamini Dials, couldn't touch metal, couldn't see a corpse, and couldn't even sleep outside his own bed for a single night. Basically ancient HR policies, but divinely enforced.
Festivals, or an excuse to take a week off work. Romans loved festivals. They had hundreds of them, some solemn, others raucous, and most involving wine. Religious holidays were how Romans filled their calendar and their free time. There was Saturnalia, the festival of Saturn, held in December. For a few glorious days, social order flipped. Slaves dined with masters, gambling was legal, and everyone wore silly hats. It was chaotic, merry, and suspiciously similar to modern Christmas, if Christmas involved more public drunkenness and fewer sweaters. Then there was Lupercalia, the fertility festival. Young men ran around the city wearing goat skins, striking women with leather thongs to ensure fertility. And yes, it's every bit as awkward as it sounds. Other festivals honored specific gods. The Floralia, for Flora, goddess of flowers, was basically an ancient spring break. The Vulcanalia, for Vulcan, involved bonfires to prevent city fires, which worked about as well as you'd expect. The Parentalia honored the dead, because even the afterlife deserved proper Roman management. Superstition and magic, or when logic took a day off. For all their organized religion, Romans were deeply superstitious. Omens were everywhere. A sneeze, a blackbird, or a dropped loaf of bread could be a sign from the gods. Before major decisions, people consulted augurs, who read the flight patterns of birds. If the birds didn't behave, you postponed your plans. It didn't matter if you were a farmer or an emperor. Ignoring omens was tempting fate. Magic also thrived in the shadows. Amulets warded off evil spirits. Love spells and curses were scrawled on thin sheets of lead and buried in graves or thrown into wells. You could curse your rival's chariot, your cheating spouse, or your noisy neighbor, whatever kept you spiritually satisfied. And while official priests disapproved, they also quietly owned a few lucky charms themselves, just in case Jupiter wasn't picking up that day. Death and the afterlife, or please remember me, preferably fondly. Romans viewed death with a mix of practicality and anxiety. They believed in an afterlife, a shadowy existence in the underworld, governed by Pluto, the god, not the dog. Proper burial was essential. Without it, your soul would wander restlessly, haunting the living and generally being inconvenient. Funerals were elaborate public affairs. Professional mourners wept theatrically, musicians played, and masks of ancestors were carried in procession. The body was cremated, and ashes placed in a tomb or urn. The living maintained a relationship with the dead. Families visited tombs during parentalia, offering food and wine to their ancestors' spirits, because even in the afterlife, family expectations didn't end. The imperial cult, or when your boss becomes a god. As Rome expanded, religion became political. Emperors realized that if they couldn't be loved as rulers, maybe they could be worshipped instead. After death, and sometimes before it, emperors were declared divine. Julius Caesar was the first to get the promotion. After his assassination, the Senate officially made him a god. A convenient way to justify his adopted son Augustus's rule, since who argues with the son of a deity? Temples, statues, and priests were dedicated to the imperial cult. Citizens made sacrifices to the emperor's genius, blending politics with religion in one smooth act of flattery. Some emperors, like Augustus, handled it gracefully. Others, like Caligula, demanded worship while still alive and built temples to themselves. He even planned to appoint his horse a priest. Rome tolerated many things, but divine horses were apparently a step too far. Foreign cults and mysterious gods, or join our secret society, bring wine. Rome's religious tolerance meant exotic cults flourished everywhere. Some were peaceful, others deeply mysterious.
The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, offered emotional rituals, equality for women, and an afterlife of salvation. It became incredibly popular, especially among the lower classes. Then there was Mithraism, the cult of the god Mithras, adored by soldiers. It involved secret initiations, underground temples, and symbolic meals of bread and wine. If that sounds vaguely familiar, yes, early Christianity borrowed a few elements. These mystery religions offered something traditional Roman worship didn't: personal connection. While the state religion was about duty, these cults were about meaning, a small but important shift in the Roman spiritual world. Religion as routine, or just another day in the divine bureaucracy. For most Romans, religion wasn't a deep spiritual quest. It was part of the daily schedule. Morning prayers, household offerings, a nod to Jupiter before leaving for work, maybe a coin tossed at a temple on the way home. Religion wasn't private. It was social, civic, constant. Even business contracts and military campaigns began with rituals. To ignore the gods was to risk chaos, floods, plagues, bad harvests, or worse, Senate drama. Keeping the gods happy meant keeping society stable, and in an empire as enormous as Rome, stability was a sacred business. The twilight of the old gods. As centuries passed, Rome changed, and so did its faith. By the 4th century CE, Christianity, once an obscure, persecuted sect, spread through the empire. Its promise of eternal life, moral order, and one all-powerful God appealed to a society tired of juggling divine paperwork. When Emperor Constantine converted in the early 300s, everything shifted. Temples closed, sacrifices faded, and the old gods slowly went silent. But echoes of them lingered in art, in language, in the rituals that shaped Western civilization. Jupiter may have fallen silent, but every time we say words like genius, fortune, or Saturday, we're still whispering the ghosts of Rome. And so, as night falls over the ancient city, torches flickering on marble altars, priests murmuring in smoky temples, the Romans keep their delicate peace with the divine. Offerings laid, omens read, prayers whispered. Because for them, the universe was a contract. And as long as both sides kept up their end, the world kept turning.
Love, marriage, and family life in ancient Rome. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just tuning in mid-slumber. We've wandered through Roman streets, soaked in their baths, and stared politely at their many, many gods. But tonight, we're heading home. Not to a temple or a tavern, but to the Roman household. So, dim the lights, pull your blanket up, and let's float gently into the quieter corners of Roman life, where family duty met domestic chaos, love was more of a legal transaction, and romance, well, let's just say Cupid worked part-time at best. The Roman family, or all hail the father, may he be mildly reasonable. The Roman family was called the familia, but that word meant a lot more than family in our modern sense. It didn't just mean your spouse and kids. It included grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, servants, and slaves. Basically, anyone who lived under the same roof and was controlled by the same man. That man was the paterfamilias, the head of the household, the ultimate authority. And by ultimate, I mean literally life and death authority. Legally, he could decide whether a newborn was accepted into the family or left out to die. He could even sell his children into slavery, although by the late Republic, that was considered a bit tacky. The paterfamilias also handled property, finances, and family reputation. His word was law. He was expected to be wise, fair, and moral. Of course, not all of them were.
Some were just old men with wine-stained togas and far too many opinions about politics. Everyone else in the household existed under his potestas, his power. And while that sounds terrifying, most Roman fathers didn't spend their days tyrannizing everyone. Like most authoritarian systems, it worked best when everyone politely pretended it wasn't oppressive. Roman women, or running the house while pretending not to. Now, Roman women didn't have political power. They couldn't vote, hold office, or officially speak in court. But, and this is important, that didn't mean they were powerless. Inside the home, women managed everything. They oversaw the household, slaves, meals, children, and finances. Basically, the ancient Roman version of being CEO of domestic affairs. Elite women could wield subtle influence through family connections and marriages. Some, like Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, became legends of quiet political control. She smiled sweetly, embroidered in public, and allegedly arranged a suspicious number of convenient deaths behind the scenes. Truly, multitasking at its finest. Most women married young, around 14 or 15, to older men chosen by their fathers. Love wasn't usually part of the deal. Marriage was a contract, an alliance between families, sealed with a dowry and polite smiles. But women could, in theory, divorce. And by the later Republic, it became surprisingly common. All you had to do was say, "Keep your stuff," and walk out. No court, no scandal. The Romans were refreshingly practical that way. Marriage, or a social contract, lightly seasoned with emotion. Let's be honest, Roman marriage was more about status than love, but that doesn't mean affection never happened. Sometimes, against all odds, couples actually liked each other. Poets like Propertius and Catullus even wrote about love, though it was usually the dramatic, unhealthy kind. Marriages began with rituals: the joining of right hands, a shared meal, the bride's veil dyed saffron orange, symbolizing fertility and warmth. She'd say, "Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia," a kind of ancient, "what's mine is yours." And then everyone would eat, drink, gossip, and quietly calculate how much dowry was too much. Divorce could be initiated by either side, though it was easier for men. Still, Roman women were not exactly shrinking violets. By the 1st century CE, there were complaints from moralists that women divorced too often and behaved too freely. As usual, whenever women gained a bit of autonomy, old men wrote grumpy essays about it. Roman love and sex, or lower your expectations, Cupid's tired. Now, about love. The Romans were not exactly romantic in our sense of the word. They had passion, yes, but they treated it like a fever, something temporary, inconvenient, and occasionally embarrassing. Men often took lovers outside of marriage, and society mostly looked the other way, as long as they were discreet and didn't disrupt the social order. Affairs with prostitutes or slaves were common. So common, in fact, that it was practically part of the cultural wallpaper. But adultery with another citizen's wife? That was scandalous and politically dangerous. Emperor Augustus even passed laws making adultery a public crime. Of course, his own daughter Julia was famously caught breaking those very laws, which made the family dinners awkward. For women, fidelity was non-negotiable. Double standards were, of course, alive and thriving in Rome.
Children, or miniature adults with tiny togas. Roman children were treated as little adults from an early age. They weren't coddled for long, partly because many didn't survive infancy. When a baby was born, it was placed at the father's feet. If he picked it up, it was accepted into the family. If not, it was exposed.
left outside, often taken by strangers or tragically left to die. It sounds horrific to modern ears, but in a world without modern medicine or social welfare, it was seen as practical. For those who survived, childhood was structured but affectionate. Mothers nursed babies or used wet nurses. Education began early. Boys learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and rhetoric. Girls learned domestic management, music, and, depending on their class, how to politely endure boredom. Boys from wealthy families were accompanied by a paedagogus, a slave who served as a tutor, chaperone, and general moral babysitter. If a boy misbehaved, he didn't get a timeout, he got an eloquent lecture about Roman virtue. Adoption, or the backup plan for when you need an heir. Romans loved adoption, not as a charitable act, but as a political strategy. If you didn't have a son to inherit your name and fortune, you simply adopted one. This was how emperors managed succession. Augustus was adopted by Julius Caesar. Tiberius was adopted by Augustus. And so on in a long line of familial paperwork that made Roman inheritance look like a complicated legal chess game. Adoption meant you gained a new father, new name, and full rights in the new family. It was less about sentiment and more about continuity, because nothing terrified a Roman more than dying without an heir. Education, or grammar, rhetoric, and endless memorization. Education in Rome was taken seriously, at least for boys. The goal wasn't creativity, it was eloquence. You had to speak beautifully, write neatly, and argue convincingly. At around 7, boys went to a ludus, a basic school where they learned reading, writing, and math. They used wax tablets, wooden styluses, and occasionally tears. At 12, they graduated to a grammaticus, studying literature, poetry, and history. Then came rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. Because in Rome, being able to talk your way out of a Senate scandal was an essential survival skill. Girls didn't usually go to formal schools. They were educated at home, taught to read, manage the household, and play instruments. Some elite women, though, became highly educated. A few even wrote poetry, though predictably, their male contemporaries called them unwomanly. The Roman house, or private luxury meets public theater. Now, let's peek inside the typical Roman home, the domus. A wealthy Roman's house wasn't just a place to live, it was a status symbol, a miniature empire in marble and mosaic. You entered through the atrium, an open hall with a shallow pool in the center to collect rainwater. The walls were painted in vivid colors, deep reds, ochres, and black, with frescoes of gods, landscapes, and occasionally mythological figures behaving badly. There were no private bedrooms like we imagine today. Rooms opened onto courtyards, separated by curtains, not doors. Privacy was rare, gossip was plentiful, and everyone knew your business. Wealthy houses had indoor gardens, libraries, and shrines to household gods. The triclinium, the dining room, was the showpiece. 3 couches surrounded a central table where guests reclined and pretended not to notice how much they were drinking. Poorer Romans, of course, lived differently. Most urban citizens rented cramped apartments called insulae, often several stories tall, poorly built, and flammable. Cooking was dangerous, space was minimal, and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's entire love life. Slavery in the household, or the unseen workforce. Every Roman household, even modest ones, relied on slaves. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, managed finances, and sometimes educated the family's sons. Slavery in Rome wasn't based on race, but on conquest and debt. A Greek tutor, a Gallic maid, and an Egyptian cook might all serve in the same home. Some slaves lived harsh lives. Others, especially those close to their masters, could gain freedom and wealth. Freed slaves, or liberti, often continued working for their former masters as clients or assistants. Technically free, but socially tied. The Roman family structure, for all its grandeur, rested quietly on the labor of those without rights. Aging, ancestors, and legacy. Romans respected their elders. at least in theory. The elderly, especially men, were symbols of wisdom and tradition. Their portraits were displayed in the home. Wax masks or busts of ancestors lined the atrium, staring sternly at every visitor. Funeral processions sometimes featured actors wearing these masks, a literal parade of family ghosts. It was Rome's way of saying, remember your roots and your obligations, or they'll haunt you. Legacy mattered deeply. To live on through your descendants, your name, and your reputation, that was the Roman version of immortality. Children were your afterlife insurance, which, in a sense, made every dinner table conversation a little more loaded. Love letters and poets, or passion in pentameter. Despite all the structure and formality, love found its way into Roman life. Messy, poetic, and occasionally ridiculous. Poets like Ovid and Catullus wrote verses about passion, jealousy, and heartbreak. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, was essentially a dating manual for ancient Rome, full of questionable advice like flatter often and make her jealous. It was popular until Augustus banned it for being too immoral. Catullus, meanwhile, wrote openly about his affair with a woman named Lesbia, a relationship that started with stolen kisses and ended in despair, as most passionate affairs tend to do. So yes, Romans had romance, just with more wax tablets and fewer happy endings. As night settles over the Roman home, imagine a quiet scene, a family gathered around the household shrine. The father offers a few drops of wine to the gods. Children whisper, a mother adjusts the lamp, and in the courtyard, the fountain murmurs softly. For all its hierarchy and politics, life in Rome still came down to this: family, ritual, and the hope that tomorrow would dawn beneath the same calm Mediterranean sky.